everyone, this is Supporting Your CMMC Initiatives with Sumo Logic. I'm Patrick Hanna, CTO of CloudHesive. What exactly are we going to talk about? Well, first, we'll go through an overview of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. We'll call that CMMC from here on out. We'll talk about its history, its direction, who it impacts, the gap that it fills, and then we'll demonstrate how CloudHesive uses Sumo Logic to address customers' needs in preparing for their CMMC audit from the perspective of a gap analysis, generating evidence during the initial audit, and then demonstration of ongoing compliance. A brief United States government refresher. The United States government, Executive Branch Department of Defense, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, worked with Carnegie Mellon University and Johns Hopkins University to develop the CMMC program. The CMMC program eventually will apply to all of the defense industrial base that contributes to the defense supply chain. That's all the contractors and subcontractors that are providing parts, goods, and services to the Department of Defense and carrying out their missions. There's over 100,000 of these contractors and subcontractors. They generate $768 billion US dollars, or 3.2% of the United States gross domestic product annually. Over a 5-year period, all of these contractors and subcontractors will be phased into the program. The independent organization, formerly known as the CMMC AB, now the Cyber AB, oversees this program. What data may contractors and subcontractors be obligated to protect? That data comes in two categories: FCI, or Federal Contract Information, or CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information. FCI is information not intended for public release that's provided by or generated for the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government. Controlled unclassified information is information the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government. An extremely detailed list of CUI is maintained by the federal government that you may reference after this presentation. Let's talk about the timeline of CMMC. In 2016, DFARS Clause 7012 went into effect. That required all contract holders to self-assess to meeting the security requirements of NIST 800-171. In 2019, that evolved. The Department of Defense announced the creation of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification to transition from the self-attestation process described in the previous bullet to a more formal process of audit. In that same year, the interim rule authorizing the inclusion of CMMC in procurement contracts, that's DFARS Supplement 2019 D041, was published September 29, 2020, with an effective date of November 30th, 2020. On December 8, 2020, the CMMC Accreditation Board and the Department of Defense released an updated timeline that has the model fully implemented by September 2021. As we see here, there was definitely a gap in what the goal date was versus the effective date. On November 4th, 2021, the Department of Defense announced the release of CMMC 2.0. This reflected a significant change in direction from version 1.0, which we'll compare in a few slides. In March 2023, it's estimated that final rulemaking will be complete, and 60 days after, CMMC requirements will be included in new contracts. CMMC is unique in that it comprises an entire ecosystem of providers. It's not strictly a framework or a certification or an audit or an assessment. The Cyber Accreditation Body, formerly the CMMC AB, recognizes organizations seeking certification. That would be your contractors and subcontractors that eventually will be mandated to go through this process. Your registered practitioner organizations, which are comprised of both registered practitioners and advanced registered practitioners. Those are organizations and individuals that help organizations seeking certification and assessing their maturity and readiness to go through the process. Your certified third-party assessment organizations, or C3PAOs, are comprised of certified CMMC professionals and assessors, as well as provisional assessors and quality assurance professionals. This comprises the team that will actually perform the assessment, generate the report, and validate the report. Within the ecosystem are also licensed training providers, which are consist of certified CMMC instructors as well as provisional instructors. Those are the folks training the C3PAOs and the RPOs, as well as licensed publishing partners, those making content or materials for use by the training providers in training the registered practitioners or the certified CMMC professionals/assessors. So a year passed between 1.0 and 2.0. A lot of the changes in 2.0 were based on public feedback received and how the model was designed and implemented. It was streamlined to focus on the most critical requirements. It took 5 compliance levels down to 3, and then it aligned. It literally uses the NIST cybersecurity standards. Some of the feedback received was that organizations found it cost prohibitive to go through the process of CMMC certification. So focus was made at allowing companies at level 1, the foundational level, and a subset of companies at level 2, the mid-level or advanced level, to demonstrate compliance through self-assessments. It also provided increased oversight of professional and ethical standards of third-party assessors. Implementation was also made more flexible. Companies under certain circumstances can make POA and Ms, that's plans of actions and milestones, in the event that they don't, a finding is made in which their implementation of CMMC may not be complete, as well as flexibility. In some cases, waivers to certain CMMC requirements may be provided under limited circumstances. The CMMC model itself consists of a series of domain areas covering everything from access control all the way to system information integrity. An organization preparing for audit must understand its history. Where is it coming from in terms of its application of these controls? What is its current state? Does the organization feel that it meets these controls? And finally, what does the organization feel its ability to sustain that current state in the future looks like? The mid-level, level 2 of CMMC 2.0 calls for a tri-annual audit period. So once that finding is released of an organization meeting CMMC, they are then in kind of operation or sustain mode. And then in year 3, that organization is going to need to demonstrate, again, historically, currently, and future, how they're going to continue to meet those controls. As part of the audit or assessment process, the organization seeking certification is going to produce a series of artifacts. Those artifacts include, but are not necessarily limited to, a system security plan. That's the overall design of the controls laid out in the CMMC. A plan of actions and milestones, essentially for controls that are not fully implemented. A plan describing the situation in which timeline-wise and action-wise those controls will be fully implemented. Completed self-assessment with a generated SIPR score. It's basically a risk score recognized by the DIBCAC. A system design document, and then likely a series of generalized artifacts containing policies, procedures, diagrams, configuration settings, implementation mechanisms, operational logs, audit logs, monitoring, physical locations, and strategy for implementation. These policies may be recognized in anything from access control policies to vendor management policies. These policies then describe the processes that may be implemented by an organization, including access and firewall reviews down to vulnerability and penetration testing. So the key thing here is the organization needs not only to demonstrate the policies, but the implementation of those policies through controls, and the implementation of those policies through the processes, as well as supporting evidence through logs, audit trails, and so forth, that those processes are being followed. Keeping in mind that there's over 100,000 organizations that will need to go through this process over the next 5 years, and those organizations may be your well-known contractors or your small, mid-size subcontractors. Those in particular have a challenge. When you think about a small to mid-sized organization functioning as a subcontractor, creating a good or service for use or consumption in a larger product, they might be a machine shop making specialized fasteners. They might be writing a specialized piece of software. Regardless of what they're doing, what do they own from a tech perspective? Likely not much, especially when we look at some of the fabricators or those providing other types of services like that. They have their computers, their files, email for collaboration, but technology is not necessarily the realm that they work in. So they have simple needs, right? They need somewhere to work, physical presence, and a place to store, retrieve, process, and transmit the data they need to perform their job, blueprints, diagrams, etc., or to deliver a product. So as a result, many of these organizations likely have minimal infrastructure to support these requirements. They have their physical sites, their people, workstations. They're operationally capable, right? They exist to deliver a good or a service that is their domain or their area of expertise, but they might not be cyber capable. They need help. Where do they go? We talked a bit about the CMMC ecosystem. There's organizations and individuals out there that will help them understand their roadmap from here to CMMC compliance or certification. Organizations that can even provide training. Organizations that will certify or assess their state as it relates to CMMC. There's people considerations as well. People form a very significant part of the controls used to demonstrate compliance with CMMC. They can also get help from cloud service providers. This is especially key as certain cloud service providers, such as Amazon Web Services or AWS, are recognized with the designation of a cloud service provider as it relates to meeting CMMC compliance. So when you look at the infrastructure that an organization is going to need to deploy to meet these controls to support the business, a lot of that can really be offloaded to that cloud service provider. As a matter of fact, here we have the AWS version of the shared responsibility model that demonstrates where AWS is responsible for security and where the customer is responsible for security. Security of the cloud, security in the cloud. AWS takes care of a lot of the physical aspects, the infrastructure aspects. It's the physical buildings the servers are in, the connectivity, power, environmentals, the hardware itself from a networking, storage, and compute perspective. There's even AWS services that provide a higher level of abstraction in which AWS has higher levels of responsibility when you look into things like serverless and so on. The customer, of course, is still going to be responsible for data that they store, process, transmit, consume. The platforms, they need to do their job. Applications, obviously identity, we talked about people as a second bullet point on the previous slide. Then, of course, client-side data encryption, data integrity and authentication has a direct alignment to CMMC controls. So we have the cloud as our data center. It helps. It forms a big part of it. There are some other third-party solutions, though, that most organizations are going to look at. The typical small, mid-sized subcontractor environments most likely perform some form of collaboration with their contractors or subcontractors. Most likely needs to have basic storage of file needs met, but not much more else, not necessarily running complex software solutions. So what works best in our purview is a virtual desktop solution running on AWS, along with a directory service. On that virtual desktop, we could run an endpoint security package, a vulnerability management package, and we could manage the introduction and exfiltration of data into and out of that environment through next generation firewalls or data loss prevention services, and then hosted email and collaboration suites such as Office 365. That forms our technical solution. So we have the controls to meet the requirements of CMMC. We need to monitor, though. We need to demonstrate on an ongoing basis that we're evaluating user access, network access, changes to either, and so on. So we have a monitoring platform, in this case, Sumo Logic. There's also governance, risk, and compliance, the ongoing management of the controls, the evidence to demonstrate the implementation of those controls, and then even basics such as vendor management, risk management, and incident response. We also need to train and test and assess our people. We need to understand that they've all gone through a common recognized background check. We also need to train them in information security best practices on an ongoing, typically annual basis. So we talked about the challenge that organizations in the DIB have. We also talked about how the CMMC ecosystem, cloud service providers, and third-party solutions help them meet these challenges. The final piece is effectively the managed service provider, who ties it all together. Organizations in the DIB have a solution to their challenge. In the approach that we take when we deploy these workloads for our customers, we found that the majority of the controls, this demonstrated here is level 2 of the CMMC version 2, the majority of those controls we can actually provide management of. That includes the things brought to the table by the third-party solutions and, of course, the cloud service provider. Only a small subset becomes shared controls, things that the customer is also responsible for. Again, most of that comes down to people. Their hires, their contracts, the background checks, training of those. In this model, the customer has no controls they solely own. So how does that change? Organizations in the DIB now become responsible for understanding their data flows. Scope reduction. I keep referring to organizations, but an organization doesn't necessarily always have to comprise a full company. If you carve out a subset of your people that are working to produce goods or services or consume information that's scoped for CMMC, you could reduce your scope. You could do that through organizational assignments. You could do that through technical controls, literal domains in DNS, or access controls. And then further, as described in the previous slides about a virtual workspace environment or virtual desktop environment running in a public cloud provider, you effectively have an enclave. The data is stored, processed, and transmitted separate from your general data and compute needs and your general information technology needs in your organization. The point of view here is the data can't be accessed, it's secure. If the data can't leave, it's secure. Again, this model assumes that very little custom software may be used. All the COTS, the commercial off-the-shelf software, of course, would run in that virtual desktop environment. And custom software, while not demonstrated here, could be further aligned to fit in this model. So we've designed our policies, our processes. We now have a cloud-hosted compute environment that our employees, contractors, and vendors, hopefully vetted, are using to store, process, transmit, generate, and retrieve that data. We now need to demonstrate the ongoing continuous compliance of that environment, right? We talked about we have to get through the first year audit, but then there's the triannual audit where we need to retroactively go back and show we're watching the business. This is a favorite graphic of mine. You set up your server to deliver a product. How do you know it's performing, that it's working, and that it's not being used as a barbecue pit, such as the image pictured here? So how do we do continuous monitoring with Sumo Logic? We have all these sources of data we're responsible for. It's event data, it's state data. The data is coming from some of the third-party solutions. It could be coming from Windows or Linux, Amazon and Azure. We use this data to tell us our current state of things and to review historically how have things changed over time. This data, the ability to report on this data, supports the processes we reviewed on some of the past slides. We also need to be able to react to the high priority items. We can't rely on having a dashboard on our screen all the time. Those are great though. We can't rely on administrators or engineers querying this data. Push versus pull. The high priority items need to be pushed to us to assess and to work to resolution. We also need to demonstrate this is going, right? This is part of the process. So we have the slide here that essentially demonstrates the events that may be emitted through those third-party solutions. We have data coming from our firewall, data coming from our data loss prevention solution, our vulnerability management solution. We have data coming from our multi-factor solution. We even have audit data from Sumo Logic, right? We want to demonstrate who has actually queried and looked at this data contained within our SIM. We have our typical Windows data as well, right? Our application, system, and security events. And of course, we don't want to skip over the individual application event logs. We also have our cloud events. We have those events that are generated by AWS. We have those events that are generated by our collaboration suite, in this case, Office 365. And finally, we have AWS service-specific events. Represented here are 16 of the key services used to support this solution. Regardless of the source, whether it's Windows, AWS, Azure, or one of the third-party solutions we use, they're all consumed into Sumo Logic, either through a push. Webhook is demonstrated here on a hosted collector, an actual installed collector in the case of the virtual desktop environments, or consumed. Many of these logs may live in blob storage solutions, object storage solutions such as Amazon's S3 service. All of that is consumed into Sumo Logic as a queryable search, something we can search on. And in most cases, there are out-of-the-box applications available that help with the visualization aspects. This has the advantage of letting us very rapidly roll out a new service, leveraging the dashboards to give us real-time view into the state and status of those services, reusing the queries behind those dashboards, both from an incident response perspective, as well as actually building an event response flow. So in this case, all of those queries that have high-value information in them can be saved. They could be scheduled or ad hoc, queried interactively. And in the case of the schedulable searches, we can actually automate our incident management or incident response workflow when there's findings that are derived from those scheduled searches, such as anomalous login events to the AWS console as an example. We could send those to our incident management system as an incident or case. We could use the webhook capabilities in Sumo Logic to create an event to escalate to the appropriate on-call engineer. We could even consume those through the AWS API Gateway service and use step functions to create our own complex incident response playbooks, which can do things like collect specific forensic data off of systems, execute CloudFormation templates, and even possibly make API changes to isolate those machines and create backups of them via EBS snapshots. So in conclusion, leveraging a cloud service provider and a managed services provider can help reduce your organizational burden in preparing for and maintaining CMMC-defined controls. A significant component to maintaining these controls is the monitoring and response to them. In this case, Sumo Logic can be used to funnel these various sources of data and state, correlate, query, and reduce them for human consumption with both planned and unplanned levels of priority. This last one is especially important. We need to demonstrate ongoing compliance to the model, but we also need to be able to demonstrate that on a timed basis, depending on how our policies are written, that we're reviewing logins, access, changes. All of this can be streamlined through a single interface through Sumo Logic, consumed from these dozens of different sources. I hope you enjoy the rest of Illuminate, and thank you for your time.